Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
We now take up the study of industrial law and of industrial relations. For the sake of the people who are uninitiated in either, it may be simpler to begin the study from the point of view of industrial relations, and that is what I propose to do. Industrial relations encompasses a set of phenomena both inside and outside the workplace, and is concerned with determining and regulating employment relationship. It is very important to keep in mind the definition of industrial relations, because at times it is amorphous and it means different things to different people, which is clearly not the purpose of any scientific discussion. There must be a shared understanding of a definition, and then the elaboration must be logical. So, what is it that we find? Industrial relations really is relations amongst workers, employers, and government regulators, to identify just three stakeholders in the system. The making of administration involves therefore recognizing the interest of each of these players. However, making and administering of the institution and rules of work is something quite different, because what the employer administers need not necessarily be drafted by the employer, may be passed on by the government regulator, and what the worker has to observe need not necessarily be what the worker has drafted, but it may be a part of the contract which the employer has imposed on the worker when he was accepted on the wage rolls. Hence, making and administering of the institution of rules of work and regulation is another act altogether, and has overtones which are to be kept discretely different and apart if they are to have an operational meaning. The objectives of industrial relations range from having a smooth environment for transacting of business, and would cover socio-economic industrial conflicts. In other words, should socio-industrial conflicts arise, the approach of industrial relations would be useful in resolving them. The explicit and implicit bargaining between employees and employers is also a contributing element in the rules of work and regulations. In fact, in many organizations at a particular time of the year, the union and management get into negotiations, and they draft the terms and conditions which govern their relationships for a year, and then again it is reviewed. Therefore, essentially industrial relations is a multidisciplinary approach. Be that as it may, the framework of reference decides perceptions and interpretation of events. Now, it is this framework of reference which is somewhat tricky when it comes to industrial relations, and has to be understood in an emancipated manner to understand what is it that will govern the framework of reference of industrial relations. Well, first and foremost, there is the conceptual structure of generalizations. if you believe that unions are not a healthy situation, and if unionization is a pejorative word, then of course, the conceptual structure of industrial relations is somewhat virus ridden from the beginning itself. Then there is the issue of the contextual postulate and what is essential. It will also move on to the assumptions as to what is valuable in industrial relations and what must be preserved at all costs, and what is open to negotiations. There is a question of attitude about what is possible, and finally, ideas about what will work effectively. Now, whether it be conceptual structure of generalizations or the contextual postulates or the assumptions on what is valuable or attitudes towards what is possible, they all contribute towards ideas that will work and that will not work. So, this is an immensely assumption driven situation, and very few things in industrial relations are beyond the reach and interpretation of perceptions. Consider this diagram, which is built upon some of the diagrams which have gone around on one or two websites, and has application relevance for what we are studying. And you will find that approaches to industrial relations are basically taken in three heads: the unitary, the pluralistic, and the Marxist. The unitary approach to industrial relations has authoritarianism and paternalism as the fountainhead of all action, and it leads to human resources management. The Marxist approach lays emphasis on evolution and revolution, but then it graduates not so much into human resources, but rather the control of the labor process. In the actual operations, one finds that both control of the labor processes and human resources management are in an interactory relationship. However, the more complex approach to industrial relations and organizations in which they operate is the pluralistic approach. The pluralistic approach works on the assumption that cooperation and conflict are the two building blocks on which industrial relations will run, and therefore, one gets into the predictable systems flow of input, conversion and output. The input could be conflict and differences, the conversion would be through institutions and processes, and the outcome would be regulation and rules. So, regulation and rules are the framework in which conflict or differences need to be assessed, need to be ironed out, and the theatre for doing this, where the conversion process actually takes place, is the structure of the institutions and the flow of the processes, which leads to the systems integration, and that leads to social action. A wider approach to industrial relations would require recognizing the labor market per se and putting it in a comparative frame. I will leave this diagram for a few moments on the screen, so that you get a feel of it. Now, the approach is obviously not the full story, but it is certainly the vantage point of vision. To take the elaboration further, the industrial relations system and of course, the predictable acronym requires attention to 5 aspects of the issue. One wants to know who are the actors, and the actors are workers, unions, management, the government, and this is without prejudice to the list being added. What is the context? The context is labor, product markets, technology and community. This is the context in which IR operates. What are the processes? Processes are unilateralism, individual bargaining, legislation, adjudication, collective bargaining. You choose which process suits you and suits your assumptions. Then there is the question of ideology, and ideology means that there should be a minimal shared belief, the glue that gives systems stability. The ideology here is not so much a political ideology, but rather it is the ideology of work, it is the ideology of what needs to be done to keep the organization working and what contributes towards achievement of goals. And finally, and predictably, there are rules which surface in the form of pay, benefits, work rules, working conditions, job satisfaction, industrial democracy, peace and conflict, productivity. Rules with reference to all this govern industrial relations. A sector-wise view may help to understand the pattern of industrial relations which obtain, and we shall be looking at industrial relations patterns in different places, and of course, to begin with we will talk of the trade union movement in India. Historically speaking, in the post First World War situation, the workers realized that strike as a weapon of economic coercion would very often work. It would work because blacklegging was not that common, production would stop, and there would be a general sympathy for the people going on strike. As a result of all this, in 1920, the All India Trade Union Congress was formed. All India Trade Union Congress, many have acronyms for it, but that always confuses the situation. Therefore, let us stay with the full name, led to a situation where the response of government to this Congress was devising of a trade union act which was passed in 1926. So, now the polarization processes was complete, the positioning processes was complete, people were standing up for what they believed in, and people were also trying to draw the line on what they felt should not be an act of trespass into a domain which was clearly unreasonable. When such a situation happens, usually movements split, and so did the trade union movement. The trade union movement split into two streams. One was dominated by communists, the AITUC, and the other one was controlled by the moderates, that is the AITUF. The situation continued, and to collapse the period from about late 20s to the beginnings of the tensions which led to the Second World War, one thing was obvious, the ideological differences was increasing. Soviet Union was moving to the center of the stage as the largest protagonists of the trade union movement. The dictatorship of the proletariat became an ideological slogan, and the government responded equally energetically by banning all strikes and lockouts. When you have got this kind of confrontation, then it is normal for people to conclude that there is a need for a more organized movement, and that is exactly what the workers concluded, and therefore started a process of consolidation. In the Indian arena, it led to the birth of the Indian Communist Party, but that, as the expression goes, another story. After independence, there was turmoil in many domains. There was this huge, almost unmanageable turmoil on account of huge population movements arising out of partition, bloodshed on an unparalleled scale, sometimes giving the feeling that nobody was really in control. There were other social unrests, but one of the unrests which has not been given the kind of importance which that unrest needs to be imbued with is the large scale unrest for salaries and working conditions. One needs to understand that unrest, because as a result of that unrest, equations were being written, undocumented practices were being established, which will determine the nature of the industrial growth in this country for a long time to come. And as a predictable result, the strikes and lockouts multiplied. Not surprisingly, therefore, now 3 central labor organizations emerged: INTUC 1947, HMS Hind Mazdoor Sabha 1948, UTUC 1949. Many more unions were formed, and there came a stage within less than 3 to 4 decades that more than 60,000 unions could be found in India, affiliated to one or the other of central associations of trade unions. One needs to move on to recognize and understand the governance view of IR, and governance as usual took a unique view on the problems of IR and was of the proposition that decision making processes need to be regulated and monitored. The first attempt was to state that collective bargaining was not a good thing if it resulted in unilateralism. However, collective bargaining could be indulged in if it was done jointly. It also tried to create an environment where workers were expected to get permission to participate in decision makings affecting them. The transference of notions of democracy to the workplace, property rights only to provide authority over property and does not necessarily provide authority over people, were concepts which gradually gained importance, and more people were talking of it and were debating it. Nothing was very clear, and depending upon the sector you were talking about and the region you were talking about, there were different types of turmoil and different types of movements, perhaps the most significant amongst them being the kind of movement which took place during the prime ministership of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, when George Fernandez led the railway strike, which was quite unprecedented in annals of Indian labor history, or for that matter Indian industrial history. The railway strike which George Fernandez led was a very unusual strike, because the strike itself was caused after the first ever democratic balloting amongst all workers on whether strike needs to be called or not. The illustration is meant to highlight a simple proposition. The character of industrial relations in India was becoming more and more broad based, participative, and therefore, it could be argued was stronger than ever before. Industrial unrest became the flashpoints of many great social change processes, which even today have not been fully comprehended. Many would recall around the same period the strike by Datta Samant of the textile workers. Again, one of those strange trade union movements which served as a watershed on the growth of trade union patterns in India. The results were in many ways far reaching, and in terms of its general spread effect, in many ways unscrutable. Even today, a conscious walk through certain areas of Bombay will draw to one's attention the deserted buildings of old textile mills. In many cases, they have been demolished. In several cases, real estates have sprouted there, but yes, there are even today many pockets of Bombay where you see vestiges of the old textile industry remnants in the form of buildings at different stages of decay. A spread effect of the consequences of the unrest which Datta Samant led. The consequences of that kind of movement still constitute a matter of many debates, but there is an amazing aspect of that labor union which has been noticed, but not observed upon the way I think it merits attention, and certainly not researched on sufficiently, or researched in a manner which would throw up certain insights. And the proposition is the following: if the strike of Datta Samant closed down over 100 mills all over Bombay, closed down the mills in a manner that almost the entire industry was wiped out of the social spaces of that great city. And yet, the strike, which lasted over a year, did not have in its trail any shortage of textiles anywhere in the country. Yes, you heard me right. For the period of the strike, which was over a year, there was no shortage of the availability of textiles anywhere in the country. What is there left to conclude? At a logical process, such a situation would happen only if there was surplus capacity. It would have been difficult to have surplus capacity, because those were the units of production which had come up during the license and the permit Raj, and whatever be the banes of the license and the permit Raj. One thing that is obvious is that no industry could come up in that sector unless it had got the necessary permit and the license from the government, which was known to be keeping track of the capacities which the country needed, so that there was no surplus added to the inventory of producing mills, and at the same time there was no shortage, because the capacity of production must meet the capacity needs. Then if 100 mills closed down and there is no shortage, one hypothesis is there was surplus capacity. The supplementary question is, how did that supplementary capacity get created? If that is not enough, then one goes down the line, and what does one find? One finds a situation where there is no logical explanation of the absence of shortage, other than a hypothesis that there was hoarding going on, and as the volume of products receded from the production line on account of these closures or strikes or what have you, it is the surplus which was released into the market to meet the deficit of availability. Therefore, no visible deficit was noticed. The explanation is ingenious, the explanation is even plausible. There is no problem with either of it, other than one small snag, and the snag is, where was the hoarding done? Who were doing the hoarding? And how come it was released in the market and nobody got to know of the act of the release of the surplus into the market to meet the shortages? These are important questions and can't be brushed aside, and remain unanswered to this day. However, each subject area has its mysteries. Maybe this is the share of mystery of industrial relations, but it is time to move on and look at some of the global industrial relations practices region wise, so that one's understanding and perception of what is happening in India is made robust in a comparative analysis frame. Let us first take a look at the global industrial relations practices of USA. In USA, collective bargaining is the norm. Formal labor agreements involving negotiation of wages, hours, employment conditions and labor control administration is known to be the practice. Union legal authority negotiates with the employer and administer the labor contract. There is a set framework of grievance handling. It involves solving problems at the lowest level as quickly as possible. Conciliatory approaches involving union officials and high level management to solve the grievance. Sometime the matter ends up in the hands of a mediator or an arbitrator. But be it an arbitrator or a mediator or the role of a union official, the important thing is there is a established framework of reference and there are practices which touch upon industrial relations practices. This leads to a process maturity and therefore, is a happy approach. It is not the philosophical underpinning of this and its correctness of it, it is a morality of it, its ethics, its level of evolution at all which we are talking about. What one is saying is there is a framework, the framework is healthy, it works a comment. Industrial relations in Canada. In industrial relations in Canada, we find there is a multi-party democracy. Perhaps it touches the unions far more than it does elsewhere. Of course, there is a large American influence. Everything in Canada has a strong American influence. Sometimes it causes reaction in the reverse, sometimes it causes conformity in compliance and imitation, but the influence cannot be denied. The influence of Mackenzie King in industrial relations in Canada is large, because that can always be linked up with the highly decentralized and diverse pattern of work. But the interesting thing is that as compared to United States, Canada has a high density of unions. Of course, there is an explanation for this, just as there is an explanation for everything which exists. In fact, I have often felt that reality is such a harbinger of logic that even if no logical correlation would lead to the present day state of affairs, it would be argued that there is a logical force which has created the present situation, we have not been able to map it. So, the contemporary faith in logic is almost inviolable. The high union density in Canada may arise out of the nature of the scale and the numbers of enterprises as compared to United States. And we will leave the discussion at that stage and move on to industrial relations in Europe. European firms typically negotiate agreements with unions at a national level. So, there again there will be an argument, there again will be a debate, and the proposition would be raised, how come there is negotiation with the unions at the national level and why is not so in India? And pat will come the answer. some of the same logic as in the preceding slide about Canada, some slightly different. And the answer would go something like this: European states are small, and then you will be given the ratios between how many states of Europe constitute one state of India, that is Uttar Pradesh, population wise. So, on the level of scale, anything in Europe very often acquires the shape of a national framework, and the same thing in India acquires the label of the second level of governance framework, that is states, and this does not need to go to the national level. Perhaps this answer cannot be scoffed at or taken lightly. The reason is, we have to comprehend the diversity factor, the size factor, the multiplicity of experience in a subcontinental level nation like India, and we will find it easy to comprehend why negotiation agreements in India are carried out in a very different manner to the way they are carried out in Europe. Many European unions have more political power than the US unions, and that is essentially because many of the European unions are older in antiquity, have evolved gradually, but surely and securely, having considerable decision making maturity, and have negotiated powers for themselves. For example, the transport union in UK is enormously influential. It is very difficult to find a transport union anywhere in the world which has the range, depth and impact of the transport union in UK. Hence, if these unions have so much political power, they get factored into the national play of power. In getting factored into the national play of power, the reverse flow takes place and has two parallel kind of consequences. One is, the national politician in some of the European states has a build up because of his association with some union, and two, the union themselves are so deft in handling of political processes that they will not get into a situation where the national political figure uses his place in national politics to manipulate the union. That does not happen. Salaried employees in Europe, including managerial personnel, often have unions of their own. So, the notion that union is essentially a worker situation, worker defined in a blue collar sense, is both erroneous and qualifies to be called a self-fulfilling wish. The fact of the matter is, in Europe, even managerial personnel often have unions of their own, and that would be entirely logical to understand, because their aspirations are very often left far behind in the negotiations which actually take place for the distribution of welfare benefits. European unions have existed longer than those in US, something which we have already commented upon, and occupy a more accepted position in the society. We need to pay some special attention to industrial relations in a country with which we have not only all types of associations, but we keep talking of it so often. We borrow so many models from there, and indeed very often UK is not seen by many people in India as part of Europe. This is notwithstanding the fact that UK is a part of the European Union. However that may be, in terms of industrial relations in UK, the labour agreement is not legally a binding contract. But then a lot of things in UK are very sacrosanct and do not have the status of a legal contract. The Parliament itself, in fact, the entire British Constitution is neither written nor available clause by clause as something which a constituent assembly has thought through and established. The British unions are relatively powerful and strikes are more prevalent than in US. This incidence has recently come down. The British Union membership has declined in the recent years. The British Labour Agreement do not usually include provisions for arbitration of disagreement or grievances. This is a strange phenomena, especially for those people who talk of rule of law. And in talking of rule of law, will inevitably create a framework of handling of negotiations, which must have as one of its elements the quantum of arbitration, agreement or disagreement in handling of grievances, but nevertheless identifying with the processes of the attempted resolution. Then there is the issue of industrial relations in Germany. The rights of the workers are addressed more carefully by management in Germany than perhaps in many of the European states. The union power in Germany is strong. Union membership, however, is voluntary, generally one union in each major industry. Therefore, Germany is saved the bane of multiple unions and the consequences of what emerges when you have one such situation. A minority of labour force is organized. Workers can negotiate individually or collectively with management to secure wages, benefits, which often can be superior to those spelt out in the agreement. So, you can see how with the coming in of power, the union movement acquires different shapes and impact variables in different situations. Let us take a look at the industrial relations in Japan. The social custom dictates non-confrontational union management behavior. In fact, the concept of lifelong relationship runs singularly counter to this. Provisions in Japanese labour agreements are usually general and vague, although they are legally enforceable. Agreements disputes are settled in an amicable manner though sometimes resolved by the third party mediators or arbitrators, and nothing strange about that. Law commissions have been established by law in Japan, and Japanese unions remain relatively weak. Given this situation, it is natural that Japan, as a force to reckon with, carries with its work ethos also its genre of industrial relations. Then there is the industrial relations in China. I suggest you read it carefully. Nothing much to comment there, but yes, if we are looking at the regional distribution of industrial relations, we need to be also making some references to the nature of industrial relations in China. We would like to wind up this part of the discussion by a reference to industrial relations in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, labor is less powerful, unions are less present, and unusual as it may sound, workers are often compelled to accept conditions of work set by management. But then in many of the countries, especially in textile sector, the mining sector in Malaysia, the unions have been handled sensibly by the management, and similar examples of proactive behavior on part of management are present in other parts of Southeast Asia. Of course, aberrations can be cited and aberrations would exist, but one is more interested in looking at the average profile and the general pattern of growth currently and in the years to come, and there Southeast Asia comes out nearly as well as the other regions. Thank you for now.